They're just living, for the most part. They're just doing things they're not supposed to be doing. And by doing that, they're expanding freedom.
Hi, I'm Ted Balaker with Reason TV, and today I'll be speaking with Thaddeus Russell. Russell is a historian and author of the new book, The Renegade History of the United States. Tell me, why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because I came of age, trained by historians of the New Left, Columbia University. I received my PhD, and I was one of them. I wanted to do history from the bottom up, and that's what they promised that we're doing, what they call the new social history. And over the years, I found that the heroes that they replaced the old white men with actually had basically the same values that the great old white men, the inventors, the generals, the presidents had, which are essentially middle-class, bourgeois, 19th century Victorian values around hard work, the Puritan work ethic, and sexual repression and the nuclear family. Fortunately, in the last 10 to 15 years, historians who came of age after the New Left have begun looking at people like prostitutes and criminals and drunkards and slackers. And in doing that, it opened up a whole new way of looking at American history, and as this tension between the degenerate, immoral outcasts and those who are the keepers of community and morality.
So in a nutshell, what would be the main takeaways in your book that you hope to convey to people?
People who existed and operated purely for their own pleasures and interests expanded freedoms for all of us, and they broke open American culture in ways that most of us, not all of us, value, in fact, cherish today.
What's generally wrong about the conservative take on American history? What's
wrong with the conservative, meaning classically conservative historiography? I mean, that is sort of what dominated until the 1960s, which just has a very narrow perspective. It was only what we call the top-down history, and I never claim that it's wrong. I just claim that it's narrow, and it misses a whole lot of the story. And so by looking simply at political leaders or Thomas Edison or the generals, you miss a lot, and you miss basically 99% of the American population.
So what's wrong with the traditionally liberal take on history?
They were invested basically in the long-term project of the left of making the working class or the lower class into heroes. And so what they ended up doing was sort of pushing them into these bourgeois middle-class boxes. And their heroes themselves, people like Martin Luther King and the great suffrage leaders, were that as well. They wanted to reform their own constituencies. They wanted to make women and blacks and labor union members into good, hardworking family member Americans, in the service of basically managing the country. And so the New Left was very much engaged in that project and didn't ever question, unfortunately, those values, which ironically come from a very conservative class of the 19th century, Victorian moralists.
And you call it the way you described your book, a history of America from the gutter up. That kind of bottom up worldview is very libertarian in and of itself. Who are some of these gutter-up heroes of yours?
I begin with a look at the culture of lower-class saloons during the War of Independence. And they were, first of all, everywhere, and they were on the streets in all the cities. The cities were full of these lower-class saloons, and in them you found...
And to a much greater extent per capita-wise than they are today.
Far more per capita than now. And in them you would find, particularly in the lower-class saloons, you would find a great deal of racial integration. Many reports of whites and blacks in those saloons, drinking together, dancing together, playing music together, and the music, in fact, they created in those saloons became the basis for much of American popular music. Irish in particular and ex-slave music became the first sort of urban party music, and that really was the basis for jazz and ragtime and rock and roll. You found women in those saloons with men. This is before the Victorian crackdown on women participating in the drinking culture. And you just found a general sort of anti-authoritarian, pro-liberty culture in those saloons. The Boston Massacre was precipitated by people rushing out of grog shops in Boston and confronting the British soldiers on the street. Those people were almost all drunk, for sure. And they cursed, and they threw horse manure at the British soldiers, and they were a very motley rabble, as John Adams described them.
And you also remind people that he was the one who defended the
and he took the side of the soldiers because he knew that if we were to take control of this land, we would need to have a disciplined citizenry to maintain social order. So that was the lesson he took from that. We must train these people to be what the Founding Fathers called virtuous.
And one of the main scolds of your book would be John Adams. Mm-hmm. What was his problem? He pops up all over the place.
He just wrote more about this than the other Founding Fathers, but they were pretty much unanimous in this, in this idea of republican virtue being necessary in a democracy. The logic makes sense. My argument is not actually that they were Puritans. My argument is that democracy is puritanical.
What are you mentioned some freedoms that the Founding Fathers weren't fond of. Can you zero in on a couple?
One of my favorite is dancing. The Puritans were the first to attack it in the 1600s. They wrote a lot of treatises against dancing. Because it represented to them femininity, softness, and disorder, and but mostly represented sex, which is disorderly, animalistic, and primitive. So sex is always being attacked throughout this, and so dancing was, to them, and also was associated with prostitution. It was associated with general sort of public disorder.
And dancing figures into a lot of, I think, what a lot of people would consider surprising areas, mainly Irish history. Mm-hmm. You write that the Irish used to be considered fabulous dancers.
So I have 3 chapters in my dancing section. One is on the Irish immigrants, one's on the Jewish immigrants, and one's on Italian immigrants. All 3 groups, when they got here, were considered to be the best dancers in the land, better than African Americans, and particularly the Irish. And the Irish co-invented tap dance, for instance, and Jews were great dancers on stage in vaudeville, blackface minstrel shows. Italians were co-creators of jazz in New Orleans, Sicilians in particular. But through the process of assimilation, they were instructed by leaders of their communities, of those groups, to give up all things that resembled anything that was African American, and of course dancing and rhythmic dancing and jazz, of course, had to go. A lot of the classic Irish jigs were denounced by Irish leaders.
That's so interesting too, because it was coming from their own people. It wasn't some external force saying stop this.
But again, it was considered to be un-American. Mm-hmm. And so they were told, and this was at a time when the Irish first got here in large numbers in the 1830s and 40s. They were also literally living with African Americans. They were living in neighborhoods like the Five Points in New York, living with, cohabitating, fornicating with, having babies with, marrying African Americans, and they shared very much this urban lower class culture that gave rise to all kinds of cultural freedoms that we now cherish.
Another area where you sort of play with stereotypes in a surprising ways. You talk about the forgotten history of the great Jewish athletes.
Jews were considered to be the best natural athletes in the early 20th century for almost 50 years, until World War II, basically. They absolutely dominated the sport of boxing. They totally dominated basketball. And on top of that, they invented a lot of the modern game. They were the ones who made it less structured and more free-flowing. They invented a lot of inventive, creative passing and moves, and were said to be, naturally inclined to do that kind of thing. And so it was really quite amazing to see Jews go from that to the sort of classic, stereotypical, nebbish figure.
You say pirates are gay? We're often gay, and with the hats.
Yeah,
I'm
not the first one. Johnny Depp, actually, when he was doing the research for Jack Sparrow, found a book called Sodomy and the Sea, or Sodomy and the Pirate Tradition, by a historian named B.R. Berg. And others have done this as well. They've shown that there's a fair amount of evidence to show that pirates in the golden age of piracy in the early 18th century practiced sodomy regularly, and it was just a sort of common feature of life on a pirate ship, and also when they came on shore on leave. It was not called homosexuality. That's before that term was coined and before that concept was invented, but sodomy was pretty rampant, we think, among pirates. The sort of the heroes in my book they're never organized. They're never explicitly political. There's no discourse coming from them. There's no pamphlets or manifestos that I look at. They're just living, for the most part. They're just doing things they're not supposed to be doing. And by doing that, they're expanding freedom.